Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Macao government and the other sponsors of the conference. I'm particularly pleased to see the level of cooperation and enthusiasm in addressing the environmental problems that China and the world face. I'm also pleased to be back in Macau. This is the fourth time in 22 years I've been back, and I've had the good fortune of watching the development in Macau over that period. I'm particularly pleased to be able to talk about the issues of the environment, which represent one of the greatest challenges facing China and the world today. Well, we live in a world with finite resources, and we cannot and should not take it for granted. There is, for instance, limited water which is necessary for sustaining life and growing the food that we all need. There is limited capacity of our atmosphere to absorb carbon. Beyond a certain level, the scientific community has recognized that there will be unacceptable levels of climate change with increasing temperatures, increased weather volatility, changing sea levels. But even before we reach these limits, here in China, the level of pollution will reach levels that are a threat to health. In fact, it's already happened. I just came back from Beijing, where there were warnings not to leave where you were staying and go outside because of the threats to your health. These environmental problems are already also affecting development. Many foreign investors are reluctant to come to certain places in China because of the worry about the health of their workers, the health of their CEO and the other executives. And that illustrates a theme I want to come back to several times in this presentation. Good environment means good economic policies. It used to be thought that pursuing a good environment would only come at the expense of economic growth. But I want to emphasize that, in fact, good environmental policy is an essential part of good economic policy. It was welcome that at the third plenum, this notion that the intertwining of environment and economic growth were absolutely essential for the future of China. As we think about the nature of these environmental risks that the world faces, particularly with respect to global warming, we have to recognize that there is some uncertainty about the consequences about the future. There's uncertainty about the consequences of different levels of atmospheric concentration, and further uncertainties about the effects of different policies, and still further uncertainties about the technologies which could address the problems of climate change by reducing emissions or through carbon storage. Technology is important. There have been amazing advances in technology, many represented here at in this exhibition. The advances in China in lowering the cost of solar panels has made a contribution not only to China, but to the world's economy. Conferences like this and exhibitions sharing these advances around the world are absolutely essential to make sure that these advances in technology spread rapidly. But the problem is that there are some, I call techno-optimists, who believe that some technological miracle will save us from the threat of global warming, as it saved us from the Malthusian disaster Thomas Malthus talked about 2 centuries ago. If you remember, he was worried then that limited amount of land would lead eventually to the conflict between the limited amount of land and population growth would lead to a disaster where people would die, and that's not happened because we've had advances in technology that have increased agricultural productivity. But I don't think that we can count on these technology advances to save us from the environmental disasters that we face. So far, most of the surprises that have been on the negative side. I served on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 1995, the group that analyzed the effects of climate change, global warming, increasing the effects of increasing greenhouse gases. It was a group that shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. We were aware back almost 20 years ago of the risk posed by increases in climate, in the atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. But most of the surprises since then have been on the negative side. We didn't understand then the full import of the increases in methane from the melting in the tundra in Siberia. We didn't fully understand the role of the Arctic and the ice in the Arctic in reflecting solar heat. We didn't anticipate how fast the Arctic ice cap would melt, or Greenland would melt. We didn't fully appreciate the consequences for weather variability of global warming. All of these things have meant that the problems of greenhouse gases, the problems of global warming, of climate change, are far worse than we realized 2 decades ago. And it's in this context that I want to argue for what might be called the precautionary principle. We have only one planet. Precaution means that we should do what we can to reduce carbon emissions, and this is an urgent matter, especially because the costs of doing so now are low, especially in comparison to the potential cost of not doing so. There's an old joke about 2 planets in the atmosphere going by each other. One of them has a big frown, and the other one looks happy. And one planet, the one happy one, says to the one with the frown, "What's the matter?" And the sad planet says, "People." And the happy one says, "Don't worry, it doesn't last very long." So it emphasizes the importance that if we don't deal with the problem of climate change, our planet is at risk. If we had 1,000 other planets to go to, we might say, okay, we'll gamble, we'll take a risk. And if this doesn't work out, we'll go on to the next. But we don't have 1,000 ones. We have one, and we have to take that as a treasure. We have to preserve it. The international community has been discussing the post-MDG agenda. At the year 2000, the international community got together and assessed what should the goals be in the new millennium. They talked about fighting poverty, reducing poverty by half. They set up a whole set of other goals, including climate change. Those goals were enormously successful. They focused the international attention on these vital issues. And overall, the goals have been met. China, of course, has played a very big role in the goal of reducing poverty. The consensus now is that the post-MDG goals should be around sustainable development. But there's a broad consensus that there needs to be a broader interpretation on what we mean by sustainable development. It's not just environmental sustainability, but also economic, social, political sustainability. And these are all intertwined. I want to spend a few minutes talking about economic sustainability because I do think it's important. But as I'll emphasize in a few minutes, economic sustainability is very closely intertwined with other aspects, social and environmental sustainability. Growth in the U.S. before the 2008 crisis was not sustainable. Many people looked at that growth and looked at it with envy. I remember many people, for instance, in Europe, looking at America's growth and saying, what can we do to emulate, to imitate the American model? We don't hear that quite so much anymore. The reason it wasn't sustainable was partly that it was built on a mountain of debt. But one of the reasons for the mountain of debt was that it was compensating for what would otherwise have been an insufficiency of demand, which itself would have led to a weak economy. So in short, the economy was fundamentally weak before the crisis. These weaknesses were masked over by the bubble, which generated strong demand, but the breaking of the bubble left a legacy of debt, further weakening the economy. And this analysis helps explain why it is 6 years after Lehman Brothers, more than 6 years after the breaking of the bubble in the United States has not recovered. Europe is still in very bad shape. They're celebrating the growth is finally turning positive. But as the Secretary of State for Portugal can tell you, Portugal is in depression. Greece is in depression. Spain is in depression. People don't like to use that word, but the economic downturn in Europe is worse in many of these countries than the Great Depression. If you look at GDP adjusted for inflation and adjusted for the increase in the working force, output is lower in virtually all the European countries than it was before the crisis. That's zero growth over more than a half a decade, and very little prospects in no light at the end of this tunnel. Even the most successful country, Germany, has grown at a rate of barely 1%, which in normal times would be considered a failure. And as I'll comment in a minute, even though there's been growth, very mild, a very large fraction of their society, about a third, has actually seen their incomes decrease. Well, the question is why, what was going on that led to this weak economy? And I believe that a key reason for the weak economy was the growing inequality. Those at the bottom spend more as a percentage of their income than those at the top. So a redistribution from the bottom to the top lowers overall demand. But in the aftermath of the crisis, inequality has become even larger. People have been hurt not only by the unemployment, but by lowering wages and by the cutback of government services. What's happened in the United States highlights how bad things have become. 95% of the growth since the crisis has gone to the top 1%. And that means that most Americans have seen no recovery. Their economy is still in recession. And this is part of the explanation for why the recovery in the United States and in Europe has been so weak. Well, this brings us to what I view is a fundamental change in our perspectives on inequality. It used to be said that Yes, inequality is a problem, but if you want to address the problem of inequality, you'll have to give up on economic growth. There's a trade-off. But the new perspective says there is no trade-off. We could have more equality and a better economy. This is the main message of my recent book called The Price of Inequality. What I'm trying to argue is that we pay a price for the high level of inequality in the United States, in Europe, in China, and many other countries around the world. Interestingly, this is a view now that has now become mainstream. The IMF has emphasized the adverse effects of inequality on economic performance. Madame Lagarde, the managing director of the IMF, in a speech that she gave just a couple of days ago in Beijing, emphasized how inequality in China represented a threat to its sustainable growth. Research at the IMF, research that I've done, research that others have done, has shown that inequality leads to lower economic growth, less sustainability, more instability. There are many channels through which this is brought about. There are impacts on public investments. I mentioned the impacts on stability. One of the most invidious aspects of inequality that has manifested itself in the United States and in other countries is inequality of opportunity. Question of opportunity is a basic value that most of us share. What we mean by opportunity is, to what extent does a child's life prospects, his ability to get an education, to get a good job, to what extent does that depend on the income and education of his parents? Most of you know about the idea of the American dream, that anybody can make it from the bottom to the top. Unfortunately, that's a myth. There are some examples. You'll read about them, and those people are to be congratulated because they succeeded in spite of odds. And it is good that our society has some people that can go up from the bottom to the top. But when an economist or a social scientist talks about equality of opportunity, they mean, what are the probabilities? What are the likelihoods? And in those terms, America has less opportunity than any of the other advanced countries. And that means the life chances of a young American are more dependent on the income and education of his parents than in other advanced countries. And there's a close correlation between inequality of outcomes and inequality of opportunity. So given the high level of inequality of outcomes in the United States, the highest in the advanced countries, it's not a surprise that there is this lack of equality of opportunity. But that has some important consequences. It means that those at the bottom are not being able to live up to their potential. If a child chooses the wrong parent, his life chances are impaired for the rest of his life. And that means we are not using our most important resource, our human resources. This is a particular issue for China today. China today has a level of inequality that is comparable to that of the United States. What's remarkable about China's inequality is that 35 years ago, it had very little inequality. So while China's growth has been the most remarkable in the world, while China succeeded in moving hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, while every group in China succeeded in seeing their incomes grow, those at the top grew much faster than those at the bottom. And so the gap between the bottom and the top increased, and inequality in China has increased to the level, as I said, where it's comparable to that of the United States. And that, of course, means that some of these concerns that I raised for the United States, that the IMF has raised, are particularly relevant for China as it goes forward. One of the problems is that we too often focus on GDP. But our GDP numbers don't reflect these realities. Before the crisis, it appeared as if the U.S. economy was doing well, according to the GDP numbers, but we were misled. Numbers didn't reflect any of the dimensions of non-sustainability. It didn't reflect the worsening of the environment. It didn't reflect the growing inequality. And this is the major message of the International Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress, which I chaired. We criticized the notion of what we called GDP fetishism, the idea that society should focus on increasing GDP. Indeed, GDP fetishism, we argued, was one of the major sources of the world's problems. It's a false indicator of success. It's led to environmental degradation and inequality. And this, to repeat what I said before, represents a fundamental change in perspective. That by focusing on the environment, by focusing on environmental sustainability, inequality, social sustainability, and economic sustainability, we can actually get better economic performance. There's not a trade-off. Just like there was not a trade-off between inequality and growth, there's not a trade-off between environmental policy and economic growth, particularly if we use the right measures of economic performance. And this brings me to a central message, which is the intertwining of environmental and economic sustainability. The poor bear the brunt of the poor environment. Globally, we see this in the context of global warming. The most adverse effects of global warming are being felt in the tropics, in the countries with the lowest levels of income. But it's also true within each of our countries. It's the poor that tend to be exposed most to environmental hazards. And there's developed in many countries a movement focused on precisely this issue of environmental justice. Let me describe very briefly an interesting unintended experiment that we did in the United States, a very simple one. In our toll roads, we used to cars had to stop to pay the tolls. And when they lined behind the toll booth, there were carbon monoxide and other gas emissions, and then it went into the atmosphere. And then we made a little change in technology. It's called Easy Pass, a way of automatically registering whether somebody had gone through and then getting a bill or prepaying. So you didn't have the long lines at the toll booths. The result of that was that the level of emissions, carbon emissions in that neighborhood went down. But then we went and studied what were the consequences. We looked at women who lived in the neighborhoods of these toll booths, within a half mile or within a mile. And what we discovered is the weight of the children being born increased. That the pollution, couldn't see it. It was carbon monoxide, it was some other gases, not as bad as in Beijing. So you couldn't see it, but you could detect it. And it had real consequences. The children that were born after we had the automatic toll booth, so we didn't have as much emissions, had a higher birth weight. And then we know from lots of other studies that higher birth weight leads to better health, is correlated with better learning, has lifelong consequences. So just like cigarette smoking is bad for babies, pollution is bad for babies. And so when we're talking about the environment, it's not just a little cough in the throat. It's not just a watering of the eyes. We're talking about matters of life and death. We're talking about things that are fundamental to our health. Especially in developing countries, poverty leads to environmental degradation. I've seen this in many countries around the world in my role as chief economist of the World Bank. Poor people have no choice but to try to cut down the wood in the forest to get the energy that they need, and that leads to deforestation, that leads to soil erosion, that leads to lower income. It's a negative, vicious cycle. And that's why it's so important for both the environment and the economy to attack both of these simultaneously. By the same token, there's an intertwining of short-run macroeconomics and green growth. The weak economy has led many countries to shift away their focus from green growth. The argument is that we can't afford to focus on the environment. We have to focus on getting economic recovery. We have to focus on restoring full employment. I think this perspective is wrong. In fact, I think it's very wrong. Indeed, retrofitting the global economy for global warming could provide the stimulus to aggregate demand that is needed to restore the global economy to robust growth. The fundamental problem in the world today is lack of aggregate demand. It's what's causing the weaknesses in the US, in Europe, and in China. But the world has enormous needs. At the same time, we have underutilized resources, lots of people who want jobs and can't get one. The economy, the market economy, is not working the way it should. When we have underutilized resources and unmet needs, it is evidence that the market economy isn't working the way it should. There's an easy fix, and that easy fix is to have demand generated by retrofitting the global economy for global warming and addressing the other environmental needs, the other forms of pollution that have become so serious in so many countries. It's also the case that a weak economy has a strong adverse effect on inequality, as I mentioned before, with a direct impact on unemployment, indirect impact through lower wages, and ordinary citizens hit again through government cutbacks. So increasing aggregate demand will reduce inequality, increase social sustainability, and if we use the demand for retrofitting the global economy, for attacking the environment, we will have a better environment, we'll have better environmental sustainability, better social sustainability as well. Let me spend a few minutes talking about these problems, particularly in the context of China. China is facing a slowdown. Not a surprise, there's weak export growth. Its export markets, the United States and Europe, are weak. It's been recognized that even if that hadn't happened, China would have to restructure its growth model. But the slowdown in the United States and Europe has accelerated the necessity of that kind of restructuring. Now, many people have said that China has to move from export-led growth to consumption-led growth. I think that's wrong. Yes, there is scope for an increase in consumption. China, one of the distinctive aspects of China's economic model is that consumption is about half the share of GDP that it is in other countries. Partly that's because wages are very low in China as a share of GDP compared to other countries. And there's a great deal of scope for increasing wages. It should be actually very high on the economic agenda. But if China were to follow America's model of consumption-led growth, particularly material goods consumption-led growth, our planet will not survive. Going back to my first slide about the limited resources in the world, if everybody consumed goods at the level per capita that the United States does, the world won't survive. So the answer is not for China to imitate the United States, but for the United States to figure out how to cut back on its consumption and to sustain its economic growth without that demand on consumption. So what would sustain growth in China if it's not consumption? Well, the basic idea here is a very simple one. China does need to have domestically driven demand. But there are other kinds of other forms of domestic demand than private material-based consumption. What is it that China really wants and needs at this stage of its development? If you look at another aspect of China's economy, historically the service sector has been relatively weak relative to manufacturing. It's certainly low compared to advanced countries. And what are the services that people really care about? They care about health, they care about education. There are lots of services like this that are very important. The good news is that these services have a very low environmental impact. Their footprint is very low. So if China restructures its economy to have a greater emphasis on these services, on healthcare, on education, then China can have a greener growth at the same time that living standards will increase in a meaningful way. But then this raises a fundamental problem. These are sectors where governments in most countries play a leading role. Governments play a leading role in healthcare and education. There are a couple of experiments where people have tried to have the private market take an important role. And almost all of those experiments have been a disaster. The United States has a privately driven healthcare system. That privately driven healthcare system is very expensive and very inefficient. While the United States spends much, much more on healthcare than, say, France, health outcomes are much poorer. Life expectancy is lower. And inequality of access to healthcare is much worse. As an American, I would not recommend the American private market healthcare system to anybody. And there are lots of good models in Europe that one can look at. But the market can't take the leading role. It can't be market-driven a healthcare system. It has to be a government-led healthcare system. The same thing goes for education. If we look at our education system, many people look at the United States and they say they have great schools. None of our great schools are for-profit private universities. We have great state universities like University of California, We have great nonprofit universities like Columbia and Harvard. But the private profit-making universities excelled in only one thing: figuring out how to exploit poor people and take their money and give them very bad education. So again, I would urge caution as you think about private for-profit schools. At the very least, you need to have a very strong regulatory framework where the government needs to play a very important role. A third area that will be very important for China in increasing effective demand, domestic effective demand, is in urbanization. China has gone through a rapid period of urbanization, and this will continue for the next 2 decades. And the third plenum had talked a lot about the role of urbanization. In the meeting I was just in of the China Development Forum, there was a lot of discussion of urbanization. But here the issue is, what kind of cities does China want to create? With most of the people living in cities, the nature of the cities will be absolutely vital to determine standards of living. This is a theme I talked about when I was chief economist of the World Bank. I came to China a number of times, and I talked about, this was more than 15 years ago, I talked about the necessity of China beginning the process of urbanization. It was when China was still thinking about rural-based development. And I said, well, you're going on to the next stage. You have to begin to think about urbanization. And cities change very slowly. Investments that you make in a city today lock in what the future of the city will be for 20, 30, 40 years. If you don't make a livable city today, it won't be livable in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. Or at least it will be very expensive to change. So the key aspect, I think, of a livable city is that they have to be green cities. There have to be parks, there has to be public transportation, there has to be good zoning. And zoning, public transportation, public parks are again areas where the private sector can't be, the market can't play the decisive role in resource allocation. The government will have to play a decisive role in these areas in allocating resources. So yes, it's right that in many areas the market has to play the decisive role. In the areas where many of the SOEs, state-owned enterprises, are engaged, the market should play a decisive role. But when it comes to health, education, creating livable cities, the market can't play that role, and the government will need to. Now, when we think about the task of creating these livable cities, if we think about the task of creating a green economy, we have to ask the question about incentives. Economists disagree about everything. There's a standard joke that you can't, if you have 2 economists, you have 3 views, and they argue with each other. But the one thing that economists all agree about is incentives matter. But the problem in China and in much of the world is there are not the appropriate incentives to ensure a green society, a green economy. For instance, one needs to price in the scarcity of resources. I began by talking about the limited amount of water and atmosphere, and these are scarce resources which we don't price. In fact, in some ways, they are the scarcest resources. And yet we assign no market price. So there is a need for what are called environmental and resource taxes. There was a lot of excitement this weekend and in recent weeks about the fact that there is some discussion in China of adopting these environmental taxes. But much of the discussion says it's going to take a long while. I just want to emphasize these issues of the environment are urgent. People are dying, people are suffering because of the bad environment. The decisions you make today will affect the environment for decades to come. So these are matters of, I would say, considerable urgency. The great thing about environmental taxes is that they have a double or triple dividend. The government needs the revenues for health and education that I talked about before. These environmental taxes would provide incentives for those everywhere in the economy to conserve on the environment, to protect the environment. And the spending that would be financed would help create the demand that would be a substitute for the exports that will play a diminishing role in China's future economic growth. So that's one side of the story, trying to create the appropriate incentives. The second side of the story in China is taking away some of the inappropriate incentives. And there are two parts of this that I want to emphasize. The first is that China's incentive scheme, China's system of raising revenues at the local level, the property sales, is not a sustainable basis for economic growth. It gives rise to an inefficient utilization of land. It gives rise to excessive demand for material growth rather than the kind of growth that I've been talking about that would be sustainable. And so China has to move away from the basis of local governments depending on property sales to some system of revenue sharing. New taxes will have to be raised beyond the environmental taxes that I talked about. There need to be property taxes, capital gains tax, and there's a lot of resistance to each of these ideas. But I want to emphasize again the urgency of the issues that I'm talking about. The second aspect at the local level that's very important is providing local officials with the right benchmarks of success. People are always being judged on how well they're doing, and local authorities, like people everywhere, want to seem to be doing the right thing. And they're going to strive to do what people care about. And in the past, they cared about one thing, GDP. And so, because their future job prospects depended on GDP, they worked hard to increase GDP. And they did a very good job. But they didn't focus on something else, the environment. They weren't punished for environmental degradation. And this is a very basic message that the Commission on Economic Performance and Social Progress emphasized. What we measure affects what we do. And if we measure the wrong thing, if we use the wrong benchmarks, we'll get the wrong outcomes. So if we don't incorporate into our measures of success, of measuring whether a local governor or a local mayor is doing well, and say, okay, not only do you want jobs for your people, but you also have to protect their health. And you have to protect their health partly by protecting the environment. We're going to measure that. And if you don't do well in the environment, you won't progress. You won't get promoted. And if we make promotions depend on the environment, the ingenuity, the cleverness of these local officials, which have brought such success in the economy, I am sure will bring success in protecting the environment. So the key issue that I want to focus on that economists say, if you give people the right incentives, they will do the right thing. The problem is, in the past, China and most of the other countries in the world have given the wrong incentives. Not a surprise, then, that they've done the wrong thing, and their environment has not been protected. So that brings me to the question of what really matters. And as I've said over and over again, it's not GDP today, but living standards today and in the future, not just for the top 1% or the top 10%, but for all citizens. Growth is, as we usually measure it, is not. We have to recognize that current policies aren't accomplishing, current policies have done a great deal. They have made a major accomplishment in moving people out of poverty. But China is now moving into the next stage of its development. And it's imperative at this stage that it focus on these other dimensions that I've talked about: health, education, and more broadly, protecting the environment and promoting equality. There are policies that strengthen the economy today and simultaneously protect the environment and reduce inequality. The central theme that I've tried to highlight today is there are not the trade-offs that people used to think there were. That we can have a better environment and a stronger economy. We can have a more equal society and a better economy. That if we can succeed in reorienting our policies, we can have both a better environment, a more equal society, and a more rapid and sustained economic growth. So what we need to do is to focus on sustainability in all of its dimensions: environmental, economic, and social sustainability. We need to promote the well-being of all the citizens, increasing the standards of living for all. And I hope the efforts in this meeting to focus on this key dimension of the environment will be an important step forward in China's ability to achieve these goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz.